Okay, we are up and running. Let's see what we can do today to learn a little bit about our double parshiot of Vayakhel-Pekudei. We're actually not going to go through all of both of these Torah portions because, well, we would be here much longer and we wouldn't be able to go as in depth. But I did want to take a look at something that is one of the most paradigmatic parts of how we understand Shabbat. Shabbat gets a lot of screen time in the Torah, but it also doesn't have an awful lot of depth. That is to say, God gives us the command of Shabbat, and he gives us a general phrase of what it is we are supposed to do and what we are supposed to not do, but we don't get a lot of detail. In fact, we get so little detail that where we find detail, for example, in this week's Torah portion, it is something which draws our attention. And the particular detail we get this week is fire. Don't make fire on Shabbat. When I lived in places where gas was the norm for how people would cook and do things, this was usually one of the things that I would list as a first step into Shabbat observance. Right? So whatever else you are currently undertaking, try just not lighting fire for the coming Shabbat. Try not to turn on the stove. Try not to turn up the furnace. Just, set it in advance and cook what you need before Shabbat begins, and just try to go the day without fire. And this was a very easy thing. Here in Florida, where most people only have electric, it's not such a big deal. Here, usually I recommend putting these things down. Go the day of Shabbat without writing, as being sort of putting your toe in the water to see what it's like to really observe Shabbat with the restrictions, and then building from there. But because we get a specific mention of not making fire on Shabbat, and we don't get a lot of mentions of other things, this draws attention. And that's what we're going to be focusing on. So let's go ahead and get some of the basic Torah in, and then we'll see what our commentators have said about this over the last few thousand years. We are on page 552, which is right at the beginning of Vayakhel. We're in chapter 35, verse 1. So that's 552, chapter 35 of the book of Shemot, book of Exodus. And we're all ready for me?
Here we go. Moses then convoked the whole Israelite community and said to them, "These are the things that the Lord has commanded you to do. On 6 days, work may be done, but on the seventh day, you shall have a Sabbath of complete rest, holy to the Lord. Whoever does any work on it shall be put to death. You shall kindle no fire throughout your settlements on the Sabbath day."
All right. Perfectly straightforward. How in the world am I going to make this last for an entire lunch and learn discussion? Well, first of all, I want to point out something, as is my usual tactic, of translational just smoothing. If you look back in that verse 2, on 6 days, work may be done. It doesn't actually use any Hebrew word for may, for permitted, right? Instead, it says, 6 days, you will do your work, right? You will do work, rather, not even your work. 6 days, you will do work. And on the seventh day, it will be to you a holy day of rest, of cessation. And you will not do your work. Make sense? Okay. If I've gotten the word work, why do I need to be given the word fire? And if I've been given the word fire, why do I need the word work?
Well, today we have the convenience. We turn on and off, and we have fire, whether it's electric or gas. But I'm assuming back in those days they may have to gather logs or something. It was
a bit more of an ordeal.
A big task to start some sort of fire.
That's absolutely true. But my point is, if I've got this word work, the Hebrew word being melacha, if I say don't do work, if fire is work, don't I already know that? And if fire isn't work, then why am I being told not to do it if it's bonus, right? So is this a subcategory of work, Or is this an additional activity which isn't melacha, which isn't work, but is also being prohibited? So this is what happens when you have lists or short lists in the Torah, is our sages have to scratch their head and say, wait a minute, we've got a category and then we have an example. Is that example included within the category, or is that example added to that category? Is that example exhaustive, or is that example representative? And therefore, what should we be learning from how the Torah was put together? You may have noticed we don't have any specific examples of any other work in this particular section, except that we do in the next few phrases.
Moses said further to the whole community of Israelites, "This is what the Lord has commanded. Take from among you gifts to the Lord. Everyone whose heart so moves him shall bring them. Gifts for the Lord, gold, silver, and copper, blue, purple, and crimson yarns, fine linen, and goat's hair, tanned ram skins, dolphin skins, acacia wood, oil for lighting, spices for the anointing oil, and for the aromatic incense, lapis lazuli, and other stones for the setting, for the ephod and the breastpiece. And let all among you who are skilled come and make all that the Lord has commanded. The tabernacle, its tent, its covering, its clasps."
Pause. Okay. And then the very, very long list.
Long list, yes. The lampstand for lighting.
A list. A list.
Yeah.
What were we looking for when we wanted to define our word work and we only got the word fire? We wanted a list of work that we weren't allowed to do. This is where the list comes. Right. The rabbis say that the work that was done in order to build the tabernacle is the list of work that is prohibited on Shabbat. Because we can't just say work, because work in a generic non-technical term is a little loosey-goosey for something that incurs the death penalty if done as a willing violation and declaration of a rejection of God in Shabbat. You don't really want to just say, oh, works whatever you feel like, when those are the stakes that you're playing with. You really want to have a definition of work. And if you had the definition of, well, it depends how many calories you burn. It depends how much energy you have to put into the system. Does it depend on whether you're getting a salary for it? No. What is a work? Work is that which was used for building the temple, or building the Mishkan, the tabernacle. And since its work was stopped for Shabbat, all the more so any other work of similar kind should be stopped for Shabbat. Make sense? Okay. So, which brings us back to my original question. Those other categories of work are not enumerated. The rabbis are able to extract them from the text and to go through a list of 39 categories. But the word fire is enumerated. Why is that spelled out and the others not? And that is going to lead us to our commentary. I know, it always looks like such an easy passage.
But how they would have had to be living.
Yes?
You would have had to keep a fire. If you banked.
Yeah, you wouldn't normally start from scratch each time you wanted to build a fire. You would usually have at least embers, if not coals and other things that were constantly burning, that you would maintain in order to make your fire continue. I mean, that was normal. And indeed, all the way up until the 20th century in many parts even of America, people would go to bed by banking their fire to keep the embers hot and covered in an insulation of ash. And then in the morning, they would uncover it, put new kindling on it, and boom, now they're doing breakfast.
You forget that they didn't have matches in those days, just light something.
Correct.
To start a fire, I just realized I hear you talk. It was a big deal. It wasn't easy.
A lot of work.
Well, it takes a lot of planning. I mean, if you're in the middle of, if you're Tom Hanks in the middle of an island, it's much harder. But with matches, it's not too bad.
Yeah, but they didn't have matches then,
right.
So God said, don't do that kind of work.
But again, are we slipping back into the definition that it's only prohibited because it's effort? Because if the definition becomes effort, then now that I have electric ignition on my gas stove, Should that count as work? Yes, it does still count as work. Just make sure everybody knows that, right? Because the definition of malacha is not about how much effort it takes. The definition of malacha is the purpose it achieves, right? What are you doing with it? Are you doing the things that were done during the construction of the Mishkan? That is what is prohibited. Even if it is incredibly simple for you now, and it was much harder for them, it isn't about the relative effort. It's about the relative accomplishment, what you are actually doing with the work. Make sense? Okay, so let's get down to fire in more detail. This is the first here is taken from Lekach Tov.
The Torah only prohibited creative labor. This teaches us that if fire is kindled from before Shabbat and it remains lit on Shabbat, this is not kindling on Shabbat, for it was lit yesterday.
All right, so basic premise, in case you've ever wondered why you have Shabbat candles. If fire is prohibited, how come we have Shabbat candles? Because we light the candles before Shabbat, right? And that way the light is still with us through Shabbat. So we're not prohibited from enjoying the fruits of labor on Shabbat, that the labor was started before Shabbat. We're only prohibited from doing the creative labor on Shabbat. So therefore I can sit and enjoy the light of Shabbat that I lit beforehand. However, it is a good reminder, and this is something that has come up a few times with different congregants, so I like to say it generically and make sure everybody is on the same page. This is a good reminder that if you happen to get home late from work on Friday afternoon or Friday evening, and it's already past the start of Shabbat, as much as you may want to have the Shabbat candles there for your dinner, don't light, right? Lighting, once it's already become Shabbat, is prohibited. As much as we may want those candles lit, that needs to be done before Shabbat itself actually begins, and work out with your partner or someone else to have them light early. You can always say the blessings later, but get them lit before Shabbat begins. Okay.
What about the stupid question?
There's no such thing.
The time you're supposed to light the candles
Mhm.
is 18 minutes before the real darkness, before the Shabbat actually comes.
Well, even more than that, but yeah,
Yeah.
before sundown, not
So
darkness.
Can you light candles in those 18 minutes?
As an emergency, yes.
Is emergency.
Right. So that is the
That's stupid.
it is no, it's not.
No,
It-
no, no, it's
that's the belt and suspenders.
Because I have
Right.
problems with the wife all the time about that.
Right. So if you miss the window, if you're 16 minutes before sundown rather than 18, you can still light. Once it's sundown, then we stop.
I know. But I have problems.
Well,
I wish she was here for you.
Just go on your computer and.
yeah, that's it. You can pull up the recording. So yeah, that is a buffer zone. But like any good buffer zone, it means that you can use it if necessary. But also, like any good buffer zone, you shouldn't get in the habit of using it, because that's how mistakes happen. And then it's all of a sudden it's only 1 minute before, and now the match didn't strike, and I have to go to the other box, and by the time I come back, I'm over the line. So there's a reason to have a buffer.
Earlier.
Yes, you can light much earlier than the 18. You don't have to light on the 18-minute mark.
Yeah, no,
Yeah.
no, I mean, if you an hour before.
As long as the candles are still going to be burning.
Yeah.
You have to make sure.
Yeah, if your candles are going to burn down before it's actually dark, then you kind of missed it. But
But when you say light them earlier, you mean light them, but don't say the blessing yet.
Well,
Because once
you
you say
can-
the
no,
blessing, it's Shabbat.
true,
And
you
now
can
you
welcome
can
Shabbat early. You can.
welcome.
Yes.
But if
Yeah.
you do, understand, you
That-
can't still be watching television.
Right, you
also.
don't light the candles for Shabbat and then go do your taxes.
Right.
Right. You can pre-light them, get them ready, do your taxes, come back, say the blessing, welcome Shabbat, accept Shabbat formally, and then the taxes are going to have to just wait. I figured since it's that season, it might be the kind of thing people are thinking about.
Oh, yes.
All right, onward.
Understand that it does not say one should not see fire, as is the case when discussing chametz.
Which is, of course, the leavening that we get rid of during Pesach, right? Where we are prohibited from even having or seeing it in our house. For fire, nothing, or for any of the melacha, nothing says we can't see it from occurring or can't benefit from it, as long as it wasn't performed on Shabbat.
Fire is only actually prohibited on the actual day. Does that mean lighting the fire, or
Yes.
lighting the fire is only actually prohibited? The greats of every generation disagreed only regarding what one could use to kindle this flame, which teaches us that this was a Kabbalah for
A received
Israel,
tradition, right?
a tradition for Israel from the days of Moshe Rabbeinu to kindle this flame.
Right. So what he adds at the end there is just a reminder that in case you were wondering, lighting the candles for Shabbat is something that we have been doing for a very, very, very long time. The only thing that people argued about was what should you use to light the candle, not should you light the candle. And I should point out, it's not really a candle for most of our history, were oil lamps. And then the question was, which type of oils did you use? Which types of wicks did you use? Those were much more important in days gone by when we didn't just have ready-made paraffin wax candles that worked so beautifully. But everybody agreed that you should light a light pre-Shabbat so that there would be light on Shabbat. And there's never been an opinion in Jewish tradition that said no lights on Shabbat, sit in darkness. In fact, it's always been the opposite, that we should definitely have a light going on Shabbat.
No, the Karaites.
And they do not count as mainstream Judaism.
They do not. And I want you to know that they do not count.
Right. I mean, the Karaites, indeed, that was one of the things that they said very specifically, which was that they did not believe that you should have the fire on Shabbat, even if it were lit before. And that is one of the reasons why they don't count as mainstream Judaism.
And yet, nowhere, if I recall correctly, in Torah does it mention anything about lighting lights on Shabbat, before Shabbat, so that you can have lights.
Correct.
It's not
Correct.
in there. That's
The rabbis deduce from the Torah that we should have light on Shabbat that was lit pre-Shabbat. But nowhere in the Torah does it say
because it says
explicitly.
From the days of Moshe Rabbeinu. From the days of Moshe Rabbeinu, I don't think they were doing that. It doesn't say.
Well, I think actually they were. I mean, so this is a question of both when he says Kabbalah, which means not mysticism, but a received tradition. But the idea here is not just that it was a received tradition, but it simply makes sense for the same reasons that the Talmud discussed having a light on Shabbat in your home, which is a day, in particular the night, without light. It's very hard to have oneg. It's very hard to have joy when you are stumbling around in the dark over your family. So having light is a very important aspect of human gladness. And so the idea of having the best day of the week be completely dark just doesn't work. Okay. Onward.
In all of your dwellings. That means the tabernacle was exempt from all these restrictions because it was not a residence for human beings. Communal sacrifices were offered as usual.
All right. So, all right. So go back to our verse 3, right? It is verse 3, right? Where it says, "Do not create fire. I do not kindle fire, bechol moshvotechem," right? In any of your dwellings, right? I think the term they use is settlements, which can also work. But the idea here being that it's the your dwellings, not my dwellings, not my Mishkan, says God, but your dwelling. So in my Mishkan, in my temple, in my tabernacle, there will be fire. Indeed, there will be sacrifices, which will be consumed in fire. And that will happen even on Shabbat. There were sacrifices that happen on Shabbat. So this is where the distinction is coming, is because the phrase specifically says, don't make fire in your house. But that means that your house is different than my house, says God. And in my house, there will be fire. How we doing with that? And if you weren't sure that there were sacrifices on Shabbat, why do you think we do Musaf? Right? That Musaf, the Amidah, is specifically reminiscent of the sacrifices that were added, which is what Musaf basically means, for Shabbat. So within the temple and within the tabernacle before it, the Mishkan that is being built here, we were absolutely commanded to have those sacrifices on Shabbat, even though it meant lighting a fire, or using fire, I should say. The fire would have already been lit.
Is this where we get the expression, do as I say, not as I do?
No, this is where we get the expression spheres of influence, right? that there is distinctions between one sphere and another sphere, and that we shouldn't always expect everything to be identical across different places, different genres. That's one reason. I'm trying to give a quick example of different spheres of, you might have certain rules in your family's home. And when you are on vacation, they might be a little bit more relaxed, or they might be stricter, depending upon where you're traveling. Right? At home, the kids can do whatever they want. When we're on vacation, we have to be like ducks in a row because it's important. We're in a foreign country or something like that. So this idea is that there is a different rule in different zones. And there are certain rules when you're near an army base that are not when you're in your backyard. Certain rules when you're on public property versus private property, and that's what's happening here. I guess we could do like barbecue rules on the public beach, right? In the public beach, there are very strict rules about how you use your barbecue. When you're in your backyard, do what you like. And this is sort of the inverse of that. In your own house, no fire. For the sacrifices, yes. Okay, so we've got fire still in its regular form and still in its regular understanding, but we're still not quite sure why fire was singled out. Why mention this in this unique way rather than just relying on the generic phrase work? And here comes one explanation from Rashbam.
Seeing that in connection with the festivals, the Torah wrote that work in connection with the preparation of food was permitted on such days, meaning the handling of fire was permitted. Okay, so something that's very important to remember if you are observing the holidays, if it is time for Pesach or for Shavuot or for Sukkot, we're normally, not normally, but in general, we don't have, we have the same prohibitions that we do on Shabbat. So for example, I'm not going to be lighting candles on the day of, before the holiday, sure, but not on the day of. I'm not lighting a candle on Sukkot. But I can indeed use fire to cook my food on Sukkot. I can't use fire to cook my food on Shabbat, but I can use my fire to cook my food on Sukkot and Shavuot and Pesach.
If it doesn't fall in Shabbat.
Of course, yes, if it doesn't fall on Shabbat. Yeah, Shabbat trumps everything. But if it's on a different day of the week than Shabbat, then I can actually cook on that day, yes. And so what's being pointed out here is you might have thought, because we have that option on holidays, that perhaps that option also includes Shabbat. So therefore, fire has to come specifically to be mentioned in order to rule that out with regards to Shabbat. Does that make sense? Right? Because back in Exodus 12, we got permission to cook on these festivals. You might have thought that permission would also extend to Shabbat in general. And this line now is coming to cancel that idea. As he continues,
Moses had specifically permitted baking and cooking in Exodus. In view of this, the Torah considered it as necessary to repeat the prohibition of handling fire on the Sabbath. If this kind of work was prohibited on the Sabbath, other work, which was far less urgent, was certainly prohibited also.
So urgent, maybe the word might be better, timely. That is to say, cooking was always considered to be something that was supposed to be done on the day that you were eating it, in immediate anticipation of eating it. That's why there is a permission to cook on festivals, because food that is cooked immediately before you eat it is always going to be better than leftovers, than the food that you cooked yesterday and now you're waiting. That's why the invention of the crock pot was so big for Judaism. Then you could have nice hot food even on the afternoon and the end of Shabbat. And so what Rashbam is trying to say here is that you might have thought that cooking was okay, and therefore it had to be spelled out that no, it wasn't. And once you realize that fire, meaning cooking in general, wasn't okay, then you would also recognize any of the other things which are less immediately needed on the day for the celebration are also still prohibited. Make sense? So it's an example as well as a counter-example, so that you don't come to the wrong conclusions.
Fire was actually, in those days, a very useful tool.
Of course.
Yeah, that's actually the main tool
of just about everything.
Everything.
Yes.
So that's why specifically they prohibit fire in Shabbat.
Well, that is a reason why fire might be mentioned, because it is, this is sort of known as the Prometheus rule, right? Because of the story of Prometheus grabbing fire from the gods and bringing it to the humans in Greek mythology. You know, we always seen fire as being this wonderfully human thing. Indeed, there is some anthropological evidence that it was the early mastery of fire that created Homo sapiens as we know it, because fire allowed us to be much more efficient in our use of food and to get more nutrients from our food, which allowed for our giant brain expansion, which created human beings as we know. So fire may not have been only a human invention, it may have been a pre-human invention that allowed us to become human. So fire is very, very human. and that might be a reason that's being singled out. But we've got other options too. Or again, options don't mean that they're mutually contradictory. Sometimes it can just be multi-levels of understanding. All right, Sforno chimes in.
Even though, generally speaking, lighting a fire is not a productive but a destructive activity, seeing that it is almost indispensable ingredient in most activities, the Torah prohibited it as unsuitable for the Sabbath.
All right, so there is a general rule that, as we mentioned up in Lekach Tov in our first phrase, in our first commentary, that it is creative, constructive labor that is prohibited. That's why if you need to open a bag of potato chips on Shabbat, you're perfectly able to do so. That's not considered prohibited. But fire, even though it is mostly seen as a destructive force, because it is the underlying energy source for so much of the creative things that we do, it falls under that same category as being prohibited. So he's trying to work out the reason why fire is being mentioned here is because you might have thought, because it's inherently destructive, that God wouldn't have a problem with that because it's only creative that we have to worry about. But because this inherent chemical reaction destructive force is the energy driver of so much else of what we do, much as Yerach was saying that it's inherently human in some ways, therefore it is also prohibited. So it was spelled out for that reason. Make sense-ish? Okay. And notice, by the way, the number of misconceptions you could come to just left to your own devices. It's just one of those little reminders that we get over and over again, that there's a reason why we study together, and there's a reason why we rely on the insights of our sages, because just sitting down and reading this on our own, we might come to wildly different conclusions. We need to talk about it so that we can unify our understanding. Okay.
That's the reason, actually, the Karaim was rejected, because they go by, this is what it says, and that's it.
Well,
the Torah says...
It's even more than that. The reason why the Karaites were rejected wasn't just that they wanted to be literal. It's that it was very quickly shown to them there's no such thing as literal, right? As soon as you begin to study, you have to make an interpretive choice. And as soon as you've made a choice that you want your community to follow, you've now created a set of traditions of how to understand something that is not going to be immediately obvious to new students. And that's called rabbinic Judaism, right? We say that we have a tradition that goes back, and that this analysis has been transmitted as well as refined over the last 3,000 years. And that's a good thing. And that's what keeps us from the mistakes of just relying on ourselves, or the delusion that somehow the text speaks for itself without any additional information being needed. So yeah, the Karaites made a big boo-boo on that.
I think human nature being what it is if we're allowed to make our own interpretation, we seem to always make an interpretation to fit exactly what we want to do anyway.
Which is a very good point, that we will generally interpret to our own desire. But what's really fascinating is that we'll do that in every different direction, meaning some people will interpret it to be very, very lenient, and some people will interpret it to be very, very strict, if left to their own devices, because some people gravitate towards granting themselves permission, and other people gravitate towards restraining themselves more and more because it feels better for them. It's sort of like, I don't know whether you've seen, but there's a big movement now. People are buying weighted blankets. They're like blankets that weigh like 50, 60, 70, 80 pounds because they feel snug when they're held, in their bed. This is a very well-established and well-proven technique for children with autism and some other issues. But many people who don't have those conditions just find it comforting to be snug under this mass of literal, weighted blanket that they can sleep under. It's not weird, but it does show you that if you let them decide the rules, they'll probably end up with something a little more smothery than someone who likes to just sleep with a single sheet, just sprawled out on the bed with nothing holding them down. And that's why we don't let either group make the decision just for themselves. We bring it together so that we can sit around a table and hammer it out. Just no hammering on Shabbat. Onward.
The reason that the Torah singled out lighting a fire on the Sabbath as a forbidden activity by naming it is that to the average person, lighting a fire seems hardly as something that could be called work. If it had not been specifically singled out, people might have said that they would certainly not perform activities even remotely connected to creative activities, but they would never have dreamed that lighting a match would be considered by the Torah as on a par with that of sewing, plowing, or kneading a dough, for instance.
All right.
Right?
All right, pause there. Right. So this is coming from, a bit more of a modern source. Imagine, not the dots that can even lived in this time, but imagine for us the Zippo, generation, where you have fire in a little box in your pocket, right? Just boom, boom, fire. I mean, does that work? I mean, it takes me more effort to comb my hair than it does to use a Zippo or one of those lighters. And again, coming back here, the Tzekinim is saying, and that's why the Torah had to spell it out. Because if you didn't tell someone, don't make fire, then once fire got to be easy to make, they wouldn't think it was a category of work. And now we'd have the problems. Make sense?
The problem with fire is not just the lighting of the fire.
Mm-hmm.
It's you're actually creating energy. And that's against the spirit of Shabbat. You're not supposed to create something new.
The physics student in me is going to point out you're not creating energy, you are transforming the energy that's within the wood or charcoal or coal into a different form of energy, into a different thermodynamic state. But the point is still taken that we don't make fire usually just to destroy something. It's not just, what do I do with all this wood? I need to get rid of it. I'll just burn it all and get rid of it. People do occasionally, for burning up like yard waste and such, just use the fire to get rid of things. But for most of the time, we are specifically looking to use the fire in a creative way. We're releasing that energy in a productive manner. We're directing that energy in something more useful than sitting in a lump of coal, which is not really all that interesting when it just sits there unlit. Okay.
But fire in the outside has to be, or anywhere, has to be closely monitored. You just can't let it go. You never know when the wind will blow or something. So it's really, if you have a fire going, it's distracting you from your Sabbath rest.
It's work. Yes, exactly.
It's a job. Monitoring it in addition to just
well,
yes, but so is watching your children, and you have to do that.
True. True. You can't unplug your child.
Right.
But fire is something we have the capacity to do that.
And they do interfere with your Shabbat rest. They do.
Well, Shabbat rest doesn't always mean sitting on the sofa or taking the nap.
No,
Shabbat rest
sure
means
doesn't.
not engaging in malacha, in work. So you can absolutely play with your kids and be exhausted and
Yes.
still have kept Shabbat beautifully.
think of all the fond memories you'll have of that.
Exactly. Now, Dad Zekinim goes on to give us a little bit more of another debate.
In the Talmud in Shabbat, there is a dispute about whether this activity has been mentioned specifically in order to tell us that the penalty for violating it is not the same as for other work prohibitions, or that it has been singled out to tell us that even such an activity is forbidden on pain of the death penalty.
Right. So this is a debate that continues on throughout the subsequent law codes. But one school of thought in the Talmud says that the reason why fire is separated from the category of all your work is to tell us that even though the other stuff receives the death penalty, as fire was written after the mention of that, it therefore does not receive the death penalty, but instead is only, in quotes, a negative commandment, which if one transgresses, one gets flogged for, the 39 lashes, as it were. But then there's another school of thought that says, no, the reason why fire is mentioned after the statement of the death penalty is to tell you that even something as simple as fire is something for which you could be, under all the very particular and unique circumstances necessary, be executed for performing. It is important to realize that there is only one case in the entire Tanakh of someone who is executed for a Shabbat violation, even though Shabbat violations are mentioned in many places. So this was not a common occurrence in biblical Judaism. But speaking of execution, there was another way to read all of this.
not to inflict punishment on the Shabbat, on the Sabbath.
When it says don't make a fire in your settlements, says Rambam in his lists of the commandments, he says that means you're not allowed to punish someone on Shabbat. That doesn't mean you can't punish someone for Shabbat, but it means on Shabbat itself, you should not be carrying out punishments. More detail.
Yeah, you don't want to ask what the punishment is. One of the disciples of Reb Yishmael said, "It is written in Exodus, you shall not light a fire in all of your dwellings on the Sabbath day." Burning was in the category of all the forbidden Sabbath labors.
As we've been talking about.
And it left that category for special mention to teach that just as burning, which is distinct in being one of the judicial death penalties, does not override the Sabbath, so all the judicial death penalties do not override the Sabbath.
Right, so.
Isn't that the opposite?
No. It means that if somebody is guilty of a crime for which the execution would be burning, which, by the way, burning was never tying someone to the stake. That wasn't the way burning happened. Burning was actually an internal thing where they put the hot material into the center of a person so it killed them instantly from the center out, rather than burning them more painfully from the outside in. But as you're not allowed to make fire on Shabbat, you cannot execute someone by fire on Shabbat. And if you can't execute someone with fire on Shabbat, you cannot also do any of the other forms of execution on Shabbat. So on Shabbat, even the guilty were given a day of rest. And then on Yom Rishon, on Sunday, you could kill them. But on Shabbat, there would not be an execution. Well, actually, in fact, you wouldn't do that, because what they did is they scheduled the court days so that it worked out that no one would have to wait over Shabbat knowing that they were going to be executed. You would always schedule a trial for which the punishment would be capital, so that it would take place and be done in time that the execution could happen before Shabbat, because you didn't want to leave them waiting. Wow, it's a little different than the way we think about capital punishment in our own modern set, where people will wait for many, many years.
Yes.
All right, but that idea that on Shabbat we should not be kindling a fire is not just to prohibit fire, cooking fires, heating fires, but also to prohibit execution fires, is one more way to look at this mention and why it was singled out, why it was mentioned in a way that was different than all the other 39 categories. Good? Maybe? Onward.
The essence of the Torah is that Shabbat is when a person turns from his business.
All right. So he used the phrases Ika. This is like the root of the Torah, the essence of the Torah. If you want to understand what the Torah is trying to do, just look at this example of Shabbat. That when on Shabbat you turn from your business, you are uncovering the core of what the Torah is trying to do for us. Because that work is one of the things that, although we are commanded to do so, remember at the very beginning we said 6 days you will work, not may work as the translation softens it, but you got to work for 6 days. That work is not the purpose of your existence. It is one of the underpinnings of your existence, getting food in your stomach and all of that, but it's not the purpose of your existence. That is better exemplified by Shabbat. If that still sounds a little confusing, that's why I have this long quote from Akedat Yitzchak, and it's actually part of a much longer quote, and I highly recommend you look up the full thing, because he really does a beautiful job. I just didn't have room on the page for it. All right, so let's take it piece by piece.
Since man has not been created to sit idle with his hands folded in his lap.
Oops.
It is fitting that his activities should be commensurate with the lofty status he occupies in this universe. If an artisan ruins his reputation by failing to live up to what is expected of a man of his calling, how much more does man forfeit his claim to superior status in this universe if he fails to employ the talents with which he has been endowed?
All right, so it's just a beautiful metaphor. If there was a carpenter and everybody knew he was a great carpenter, and then one day he just did a really lousy desk for someone, right? The dining room table he made for the Smiths down the road, it was just rubbish. Everyone's going to think, you know what? That carpenter is not such a great carpenter anymore. Right? His reputation will be diminished. His status in the community, which is based upon his work, will be diminished. And so too for human beings. Right? We were not designed to sit around on our hands and to be idle, to be lazy, to be shiftless, to not be active in the world. And if we choose instead to have a life of luxurious indolence, or maybe even not luxurious, but still lazy, then we shouldn't be surprised that our status in the eyes of the universe is going down. Right? We're not living up to our true potential as what we are meant to be as a human being. Now, if you're wondering what that means to work, he's going to get there. But we got some other work to do first.
It is beyond question, then, that a special task has been reserved for man. In general terms, this task is described at the end of the story of creation. Quote, he placed him in a garden in Eden to work it and to preserve it. Quote, that's from Genesis. This verse is a reversal of a previous statement, there was no human being to work the soil. Our sages comment on Deuteronomy, he will bless you in all that you do. This verse is necessary so that we do not think we might sit and be idle. Idleness leads to boredom. It causes spiritual emptiness and degeneration.
All right, so the world first had no one to work it. Then God created us, and now there is someone to work it and to care for the world. So that should give us a clue about one of the reasons God made humanity. And then the idea that God will bless what you do implies that God doesn't bless you for just sitting on the chair. God blesses you through the actions that you perform. And those actions are opening up opportunities for blessing to occur. And there aren't so many opportunities just sitting on the sofa. And therefore, we shouldn't be surprised that the Talmud tells us that idleness and laziness, these are things that lead to a bad spiritual life, not only other problems that you might have more naturally associated with being lazy.
But then if that's the case, and what you just said, I should think that I must have to work every single day all the time, because you don't want me just to sit around idle. One day every single week, I sit and don't do anything. Okay,
but that's where we're going to have to come back to what actually is the purpose of that seventh day.
How's that? That's new.
Well, and in fact, there were others among the Greeks and among the Romans who criticized us
they said we were lazy.
for wasting 1/7 of our life.
Every single week we did it. At least once a month, maybe, but every single week. Of course, psychologists today say this is one of the best things that's ever happened.
Indeed.
Indeed. However, the effort and diligence expended in pursuit of all categories of activities whose apparent goals are measured in quantity, weight, or size, no doubt fall under the heading of useless activity.
All right, pause there real quick, because he says this very subtly, and if you're not paying attention, you'll miss it. Right? Effort and diligence expended, right? Whatever work you do that is in a category of activity where the goals are measured in quantity, weight, or size. How big, how much, how far, how heavy. Anything that you're doing that's to accomplish those things are useless activities. Wait, that's everything, I thought, right?
Yeah.
But it's only the problem if the purpose is to have more and bigger and longer. That is a measure which can never be achieved. If the purpose is accumulation as opposed to production, then you're in trouble, right? If you work in your job to get more money, that job is not going to satisfy you spiritually, no matter how noble and kind and good it is. If you work in the job to achieve something that is worthwhile, now you're doing fine. And the fact that you get paid while you're doing it, that's good too. Because, then you can keep doing it and not starve to death. But if your purpose is the accumulation as opposed to the production, then we've got a problem. He goes on and will hopefully make it a little clearer.
It's that accumulation. The reason this is so is that they are never ending. They're boundless. Those who pursue them never find rest, as someone who moves in a certain direction ought to find when he arrives at his destination. If this is so, the intensity with which these objectives are pursued do not make man any less idle or despondent.
Right? So think about that for a moment. Think about like the salesman who can't stop, right? It's got to get the next sales goal, got to get the next sales goal, got to get more commissions, got to get another customer. And there's always more to be done. And there's always more to be achieved, to be accumulated, to add to your Rolodex and all of that. in order that you can have the Rolex, in order that you can have the BMW, in order that this is a never-ending treadmill. And although you might think that's activity, it's activity without destination. And if you are on an infinite treadmill, you're never going to reach the end. And that is pointless by definition, right? Running between your home and the store, that has a destination. And as you move, you can see where you are along that progress and along that track to reach your destination. Running on a treadmill is absolutely idle because you are going nowhere. And many people, unfortunately, make their work as a treadmill. Their whole purpose of work is simply to keep going, keep working, just so they can keep working, just so they can keep working. And they go nowhere. And I don't just mean they go nowhere, because they don't go up the corporate ladder. Maybe they do, but they go nowhere spiritually. They go nowhere emotionally. They go nowhere away from their own feeling of pointless futility of their existence, which they try to fill simply by doing more of the pointless activity of running that treadmill. Maybe if I sped up the treadmill, I'd get to the end of it. But that's physically impossible. And in this case, it's emotionally impossible to get to the end of the treadmill of work if the work is only for the purpose of accumulation. Again, not trying to say work is pointless. It's work with this purpose that becomes pointless.
Because the people that I have seen now who have retired and then don't have this work,
Mm-hmm.
now they're feeling pointless. They don't have something to do. They don't have a goal or something to get up in the morning and do each day. So there might be something to be said for just continuing on this treadmill. It gives you a reason to continue.
There might be, but it's a question of, is it better to live with an illusion or not have the illusion?
That's a very good, interesting question.
Or is it better to find an actual purpose? Right. And that's whether you're still working or whether you're retired, it's finding an actual purpose. That is much more what we're supposed to be doing. And he's going to give us a little bit more of guidance on that.
Okay. It follows that man's true activities must be the achievements that can be measured in terms of quality, not those that are measured in terms of quantity. Real acquisitions would be knowledge, moral qualities, etc. These acquisitions would be truly praiseworthy. Pursuit of such aims elevates man from a state of want and inadequacy to one of ever-ascending status until all his desires reach the state of fulfillment, which is then menucha, or creative rest. Menucha
is, of course, the word that we use on Shabbat for our rest on Shabbat. Right? So fulfillment is what we're supposed to feel on Shabbat. But imagine, as Harriet was saying, if your whole life is this treadmill, then Shabbat is going to be one frustrating experience. Because on Shabbat, you're not getting more. On Shabbat, you're not getting ahead. You're falling behind. The treadmill is carrying you back. And now come Sunday, you're going to have to be running again to make up for that lost day. On the other hand, if your achievements are intrinsic rather than these accumulative things, then on Shabbat, when you rest, you actually feel the fulfillment. Right? It catches up to you as a blessing rather than you running after something else. And that is what we're supposed to be feeling on Shabbat. Again, this doesn't say that we don't work. The very first paragraph is very, very clear, actually the first two, that work, meaning manual work, labor work, work where we are tilling the soil and building things and transforming the world. That is meant to be how we busy ourselves for 6 days. But we have to be doing it with the right purpose in mind, or else we're never going to reach the benefit that we're supposed to get, which he's just going to make one last attempt to drive home to us.
Most people view the acquisition of apparent wealth as the major accomplishment in their lives. This attitude leads to these people being under great strain. It preoccupies them so much that they have little time and energy left for the performance of good deeds. The so-called good fortune of amassing such wealth prevents true wealth, real happiness.
Which is what Shabbat is supposed to bring. That day each week is supposed to be a reminder of how are you living your life? What priorities are you using? What purpose is there to your activity? We're supposed to have at least one day a week where we can sit and experience life without the treadmill of work so that we can recognize, am I actually creating something during those other 6 days? Am I really achieving something during those other 6 days? Or is my fire during those 6 days just a burning smoke? right? Am I actually directing this towards something that is fundamentally changing me and the world in a better and good way? Or am I just going through the motions day after day after day because that's what's expected? And on Shabbat, when it all calms down, when we actually stop our work, we should be able to see that more clearly, when the dust settles, which is why, unfortunately, when many people ignore Shabbat, they never give them a chance to see what their life is apart from the treadmill. Make sense? Good. Let Shabbat do its magic for you.